is to help you with the nuts and bolts video. Basically, you should always do the readings, but nuts and bolts are used to fasten parts together. A bolted part can be easily undone. Most nuts and bolts are reusable. However, there are certain exceptions, such as the engine cylinder head bolts. Threaded fasteners are roughly categorized into the following groups: studs and bolts. A bolt can be described as a threaded shank with a head at one end. The shank can be fully threaded from end to end and partially threaded, approximately 1/2 to 3/4 of the length of the shank. The head of the bolt can be designed in many different shapes. A stud commonly has two different thread sizes. One end is coarse threaded, the other is fine threaded. What basic categories are there for threaded fasteners? Well, studs and bolts. What are the characteristics of a bolt? The shank part is threaded, one end has a head, and that's not true. Bolts can be used multiple times unless they're the cylinder head bolts. What are the characteristics of a stud? A stud can have two different thread sizes, yes. No, you can use it more than once. Moving into lesson 2. Now here, the expectation is that you read all this. And I'm not going to take the time to read everything. I'm just going to read this first part and then read the titles. But please go back and read it all. A bolt has several dimensions. These are important when selecting the correct size to use. A bolt diameter and thread pitch should mate with the fitting where the bolt is to be installed. A fitting can be a cylindrical hole that has a performed internal thread or a nut. So a head diameter, I'm talking about this right here. Bolt length, here. Threaded length is just the thread. Outer diameter, so that's from the outermost point to the outermost point. Inner diameter is from the inside of the thread to the inside of the thread. All right. Thread depth, I'm going to read that one to you. The thread depth is the height of the thread. To calculate the thread depth, subtract the inner diameter from the outer diameter and divide the result by 2. We'll go over this in another question later. And pitch. Okay, that's the distance right here. So which number in the illustration corresponds to the wrench size? So if you had a wrench, where would it go? Well, it's going to go from this flat side to this flat side. So you're going to look at 7 as your answer. Okay, so what is the correct definition of the bolt length? The bolt length, if it's a full length of the bolt, the head not included. The longer bolt does not always have a greater threaded length. Which of these bolts has a longer threaded length? Well, this one over here has way more threads. You can see that. This is all just smooth. Then you have the threads down here. And these bolts have their purpose, which we'll go into at another time. Okay, look at this bolt. Is this bolt suitable for fastening two thin plates together? Do you think if you put a nut on here and screwed it down, these two thin plates are going to get pinched? No, because of all that smooth part of the shaft. Which number corresponds to the outer diameter of the bolt? The outer diameter is the furthest most point. So we'd be looking at 3. Which number corresponds to the inner diameter of the bolt? And if you're ever not sure about these guys, just go ahead up and read the reading. The inner diameter is measured in between the threaded peaks of the lowest points. So it's right here, that little inside point from here to here. If you measure that, that would be your inner diameter. Okay, so how can the thread depth of a bolt or stud be calculated? Well, it's the outer diameter minus the inner diameter. And divide by 2. And that's written, I think, right here. Yep, to calculate the thread depth, subtract the inner diameter from the outer diameter. Which data relates to the bolt thread pitch? Well, here it says the pitch denotes how far the threads are spaced apart in millimeters. So this one's a little tricky because they convert it to centimeters right here. Because it could be centimeters or per inch. Which of these bolts are the coarser of the thread pitch? Which one's coarser or more separated? This one. You see these ones, you have many little threads. This one here, they're a little bit spaced apart. On to lesson 3. This is important here because a lot of kids mess up how to tighten a bolt. Threads can be cut or applied either clockwise or counterclockwise. This is known as right-hand thread and left-hand thread. Right-hand thread is used most often. Determining thread direction. The direction of the thread is determined by looking at the thread pitch. When the thread runs from bottom left to top right, it is called right-hand thread. When the thread runs from top left to bottom right, it is called left-hand thread. Rotational direction. The direction in which a bolt is tightened depends on the thread direction. A right-hand thread is tightened clockwise. A left-hand thread is tightened counterclockwise. In what ways can thread be cut? In both ways. Whoops. Which thread is used most often? The right-hand thread. It says it up here in the reading. Right there. How can you determine whether a bolt has left-hand thread? The thread runs from bottom left to top right. The thread runs from top left to bottom right. And that should be right here. Top left to bottom right. Click on the bolt that has right-hand thread. Starts on the bottom left and goes to the top right. Most bolts are going to be this way. In which direction would you tighten a bolt with right-hand thread? Clockwise, or righty-tighty. Remember, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Okay, so this is going to be a lot of reading again. I can't take the time to read through all of it, but I am going to point out some things. Coarse thread is called UNC, or Unified National Coarse. Fine thread is called UNF, or Unified National Fine. All right, so sizes in inches are written in fractions. The fraction gives the bolt diameter in inches. The value after the fraction relates to the number of threads per pitch. So for instance, the UNC size 5/16-18 corresponds to 5/16 diameter or thickness and 18 threads per inch. The UNF size 5/16-24 corresponds to 5/16-inch diameter and 24 threads per inch. And metric sizes are expressed in millimeters. The number M stands for the diameter in millimeters. If X, an extra value, is following the first value, then the bolt has a non-standard pitch. This type of pitch is called fine metric. And examples of that, an M8, an 8 millimeter, should usually always be 1.25 millimeters unless it's otherwise stated, as here, M8X 0.75, so it has a 0.75 millimeter pitch, and that means it's going to be more finer thread. So the two standards are metric and imperial for sizes of bolts, size indicators. Which dimensions? Well, we talked about the UNF and the UNC. This is just to throw you off. What is the diameter of UNC size 5/16-18? Well, 5/16 is the diameter in inches. What is the pitch? Well, right here is the pitch. So it's 24 threads per inch from what we read. What is the diameter in metric? 8 millimeters. What is the thread pitch? Well, here we have the fine thread, 0.75. What is the thread pitch of this metric bolt? If it just says M8, well, it's going to be the standard, the 1.25 millimeter.